Democratic Congressman Ritchie Torres gave a masterclass performance on the Fox propaganda network, calmly but meticulously dismantling their bad faith right-wing talking points about border reform and President Biden's age in particular. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video. It's always fun to see Democratic lawmakers and Democratic operatives wade into the belly of the beast and take on the Fox propaganda network, debating and discussing the issues, okay? And I guess I got to add Congressman Torres to this list because this is one of the most effective demonstrations I've seen, up there with California Governor Gavin Newsom or Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, okay? So they talk about two issues predominantly, again, border reform and President Biden's age. And I think Torres does an incredible job of dismantling the bad faith right-wing talking points on both these issues. They started with President Biden's recent executive order seeking to tackle some of the issues at the southern border. And this is what was discussed, and we'll unpack it together.
In the end, an executive order is no substitute for an act of Congress. Only Congress can fix what is broken in our asylum system.
And both sides obviously point the finger at each other. House Republicans will say, we passed H.R. 2. It is very comprehensive. The White House and the president will say, well, what about that deal in the Senate that you guys had together? Yeah. It seems that it doesn't matter who's in charge. This problem is intractable. It doesn't get solved.
No, there's only one party that has a bicameral, bipartisan compromise on border security, and it's the Democratic Party. We, the Democratic, negotiated a border security compromise with the Republicans. There were a number of Republicans.
A small handful.
Most notably, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader.
Who then didn't vote for it.
Who was for the bill before he was against it, and then he was pressured by Donald Trump to oppose the legislation. But those Republicans who are actively obstructing and opposing the border security compromise have no interest in actually solving the problem. Their interest is in playing politics and demagoguing the issue against President Biden. There's a difference between governing and grandstanding, and governing requires compromise. And if you refuse to compromise, if you let the perfect be the enemy of the good, you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
So I love that. I love that response period. So because this is something that we talk about quite a bit on this channel, which is, obviously, Republicans cynically, politically sabotage the bipartisan, relatively conservative border bill that was negotiated in the Senate. Again, just to give Donald Trump a wedge issue in the upcoming election. As far as I'm concerned, that's proof that they morally own the issue, and we just simply have to make the case. This is now 100% the responsibility of the Republican Party. If you and I agree that there's a problem, and you and I both have a responsibility to solve the problem, but then in the last moment, I choose not to because I think it will hurt you, then it's all my fault. And likewise, this is all the Republicans' fault at this point, and Democrats just simply have to make the case. But the thing I like about what Torres said here is he's like, listen, if Republicans try to use the canard that, hey, listen, we passed H.R. 2 in the House, and if you really want to solve the issue at the border, then you need to take up our right-wing piece of legislation that has no bipartisan compromise. Torres is like, no, we live in divided government, right? And they have a responsibility to work in good faith bipartisanly with Democrats. We talked about this. Republicans assume that they get to be the tail that wags the dog, that they get to have everything their way. And what Torres is saying to Shannon Bream on the Fox propaganda network is like, no, even if they're happy with their version of the bill, they have to deal with a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, which means they have to give some things up. They're not entitled to get everything they want. They're entitled to get some things they want, perhaps, and Democrats are entitled to get other things they want. But the presumption is among right-wingers and conservatives, and certainly the Fox propaganda network is, even in divided government, House Republicans should get their way 100% of the time. Absolutely stupid stuff here. But more on that issue between Shannon Bream and Ritchie Torres.
But when we look at this issue of immigration, it's not good for the White House or the president. We've got new polling out this week in a number of key states, Arizona, Florida, Nevada, and Virginia. And when people were asked, who do you trust to handle immigration more? Double digits. You can see there on our screen. They think President Trump has a much better handle on this.
Look, I would encourage you to look at New York 3. So Long Island was ground zero for the red wave in New York. And Tom Suozzi was able to win back New York 3 by an even larger margin than we lost it in 2022. And he was largely campaigning on border security. So Tom Suozzi has shown that Democrats can proactively own the issue of border security. And so I don't think we should have ceded to the Republicans.
Will it be?
So this is huge, too. So obviously, as a progressive, I was not very happy at all with even the bipartisan border bill. Again, it was relatively conservative. The three top negotiators of that bill, you had James Lankford, who was one of, if not the most conservative person in the Senate on the border. So that's a right wing. You have Kyrsten Sinema, a Democratic caucusing independent, but she tends to be pretty conservative, and Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. There were some progressive provisions within the bill. For example, again, it provided counsel to unaccompanied minors. That's one such example, and there were a couple of others. But for the most part, it was relatively conservative. On the other hand, I am also well aware of the reality that whether we like it or not, the narrative surrounding the border and immigration belongs to the right. They are heavily advantaged there. And some of that is because, again, they enjoy so many advantages with respect to the media and with respect to institutions that it's just easy for them to spin things in their favor, even if the facts don't support the notion that they'd be better on it, so to speak. But again, the vast majority of America tends to skew more conservative, according to the polling on the border. As a matter of fact, President Biden's recent Hail Mary attempt at this executive order, which, yes, many view as a political stunt, and it may very well be, and it should be, in the sense that the only way to address the issue at the southern border is with comprehensive border legislation, which will require bipartisan good faith negotiation. Given that Republicans are refusing to do that because they want to give Trump a wedge issue, Biden is trying to do something to turn the polls against Republicans here, as well he should. And it says something that 70% approve of President Biden's recent executive order. So, folks, we have to deal with reality. If we want to change the narrative about the issue at the southern border, we have to work aggressively to do so. But that is not something that's going to flip in this election cycle. We're not going to make the vast majority of Americans accept a progressive policy agenda with respect to the southern border in this cycle. So kudos to Biden for trying to do something as far as a messaging issue. But to Torres's point, Democrats cannot cede the immigration narrative to Republicans. That's what's helped create this issue in the first place. I mean, again, we know that Republicans have played dirty pool with respect to the southern border for years. As a matter of fact, when President Obama was in office, we got very perilously close to comprehensive border immigration with many relatively progressive provisions, and including, issues with Dreamers and DACA as well. It was tanked in bad faith by Paul Ryan, who was, I think at the time, John Boehner was Speaker of the House, but Paul Ryan was, hoping to eventually be his heir apparent. And he advised Republicans, hey, kill this issue so we can use it as a wedge issue for the next election. And Marco Rubio, the Republican senator from Florida, also contributed to that as well. So we've seen this playbook from Republicans in the past, where they routinely exploit the issue as a wedge issue because they have no desire, rather, to solve the problem, okay, and certainly not in a way which would be optimally progressive. I do want to remind you, too, before we play this final clip from the Torres Fox News discussion, that prominent Republicans, like, for example, Mitch McConnell, whom Torres name dropped, they have publicly admitted that the only reason this bipartisan border bill didn't go through was because Donald Trump wanted it to die for political purposes. They have admitted it. There's no need to infer. There's no need to speculate. They have explicitly said it. Here's Republican Senator Mitch McConnell and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham confirming it.
We all felt that the border was a complete disaster, myself included. And Chad, you remember covering the phases we went through. First, there was an effort to make law, which requires you to deal with Democrats. And then a number of our members thought it wasn't good enough. And then our nominee for president didn't seem to want us to do anything at all. That took months.
Everybody who comes on this floor and says our border's broken, we should do something about it, you're absolutely right. And unfortunately, we didn't get there. President Trump opposed a Senate bill. We couldn't find a better way forward that would get 60 votes. I hate that.
Well, there you have it, folks. There's no room for debate here. Republicans own this issue. They killed this attempt purely for cynical purposes. So now we have to make the case that this is now 100% their fault, and eligible voters should punish Republicans at the ballot box in every jurisdiction this November. The last issue turns to notions of President Biden's age. As you know, the right-wing media narrative is that President Biden is basically this dementia-riddled buffoon. He's also simultaneously a Machiavellian criminal mastermind of global proportions. They can't stick to any sort of consistency on this because, of course, they're bad faith liars. And there was a Wall Street Journal editorial about this, which we reviewed. That Wall Street Journal editorial also pointed out that Donald Trump faces serious questions about his mental competence. As a matter of fact, those same polls which say that, President Biden is mentally unfit for office also say that Donald Trump is as well, but Fox doesn't talk about that. So anyway, the topic comes up, and I think Ritchie Torres handles it very well.
They say this about him. It says he remains a comprehensively weak incumbent weighed down by the same liabilities that burdened him from the start, beginning with the largest and completely unfixable one. At 81, he is much too old to run for president.
Before Torres responds to this, and she is quoting an article from The Atlantic, okay? And I encourage people to read it, right? It might be annoying, but I will also say here that the author of this article also concedes that there's a credible case that Biden has been a very good president. A credible case could be made that Biden has done a good job as president, starting with the achievement that's earned him hero of democracy status, beating a racist autocrat in 2020. Biden has passed meaningful legislation, managed to at least some degree of success so far, a welter of impossible foreign policy crises, and generally been a norm-respecting mensch. You could also make the case that he has been a terrible president or candidate for re-election from the start. His presidential approval numbers would likely be higher had he imposed a 4-year limit on himself and actually served as a bridge to younger Democratic leaders. Okay. And he says at the bottom, okay, and he uses a comparison to the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who chose not to strategically retire when President Obama was in office. And some would say that her decision to remain in office and dying in office under Donald Trump and a Republican Senate helped create the conservative supermajority we face today. And that's why so many people are actually calling for incumbent sitting liberal Justice Sotomayor, who I think is about 70 years old, and she's a diabetic with health issues. They are calling on her to resign as well, so that doesn't repeat itself. But anyway, I want you to note this final thing. The author, Mark Leibovich, says there is no question that Biden is better than the alternative, better than Trump, but that doesn't mean it's enough. So even from his position that Biden should drop out or should have dropped out, he also admits that Biden's been a very good president and is just objectively superior to Donald Trump. So with all that in mind, of course, because Fox doesn't mention any of that, just wanted to set the table. This is how Ritchie Torres responds. You said last year 80 is not ideal for the age of a candidate running, but here we are. What do you make of these reports, and do you think the president is up to another 4 years?
I have full confidence in the president. It is true that the president is old, but so is Donald Trump. It's a geriatric presidential race.
Why do you think they poll differently? Because people seem less concerned about President Trump's age.
I think there's a narrative that has set in on President Biden, but if you actually look at his record, it speaks for itself. He's had one of the most productively bipartisan presidencies in recent memory. I mean, he brought Democrats and Republicans together to provide health care to veterans exposed to toxic substances, brought Democrats and Republicans together to make some of the largest investments in infrastructure in more than half a century, brought Democrats and Republicans together to address the national security risk around TikTok. So I think when you judge him based on substance rather than narrative, I think he deserves re-election.
Let me ask you.
So again, great response. And he could have gone much deeper and much longer. I mean, my God, they would have had to vote another 15 minutes if Torres wanted to really educate Fox viewers and perhaps Shannon Bream herself on President Biden's various policy accomplishments. But the substance of his answer, it was really, really good, which is this idea. Number one, he refused to concede the idea that just Biden himself is old. He reminded Fox and Shannon Bream, by any objective standard, Donald Trump is old too. They would have gone to high school together. Okay, had they both gone to public school in the same area, they would have both been in high school at the same time. And then if you examine them on the substance, it's just the fact of the matter that President Biden has objectively shown greater competence as an executive and as a legislator, right? So this is the thing that I talk about, right? So if they're both old, if they're both gaffe machines, and if polls say that a majority of Americans have questions about the mental fitness of both candidates, and all of these things are true, then we have to examine the substance. And then we compare records and what people say about them. Right now, Republicans who are incentivized to talk smack about President Biden because they know it's a political vulnerability to him and they want him to lose are saying that he's an incompetent buffoon. But you know who else say that about Donald Trump? Other Republicans say that about Donald Trump. Donald Trump has numerous former staff members, numerous former cabinet officials who say that he is a buffoon who's mentally unfit for office, right? So Biden's political enemies talk smack. Trump's political allies and former employees also say that Trump is mentally unfit and buffoonish, okay? So I feel like we should probably trust Republicans when they say things about Donald Trump, given that it goes against their political interests. They have no incentive to lie, whereas Republicans are incentivized to lie about Biden. But beyond that, too, consider their body of accomplishment. Donald Trump was president for 4 years. He accomplished very, very little, certainly compared to President Biden. So given that competence and achievement of goal is a measure of competence, this is something that should be factored in. And it's something that the Fox Propaganda Network doesn't want to deal with. They don't want to deal with the fact that Biden has objectively accomplished much more of his agenda than Donald Trump accomplished of his, which is a measure of competence, despite similar situations. Donald Trump also had total control of government during his first 2 years. He had the Senate and he had the House and the White House, and also a majority on the Supreme Court. So in many ways, he had an even more favorable government terrain than Biden. Biden for 2 years, yes, had the Senate, yes, had the House, razor thin margins, but also had a hostile Supreme Court. And despite all of this, he accomplished more by the numbers and more bipartisanly than Trump did. So it's just the case that if both presidents or both candidates are old, if both candidates are gaffe machines, if polls show that majority of Americans have questions about both, then you look at the substance, and the substance is clearly advantageous for President Biden compared to Donald Trump. So the question is, how do we convey that persuasively to the American people before the election? I don't know. You let me know in the comments.